Anybody else want to chat? Come up as a speaker? What do you think the government should do to get these new drugs, etc., into the hands of doctors or patients quicker? It seems far too long for these drugs to get to market. Thank you for your question, Joseph Hallworth. I think that I'm not sure that's true. I think drugs get to the market pretty quickly. I think that the trick is getting more medicine out there, and that's the hard part. Like I think about Huntington's, Friedreich's ataxia, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease. Those are just four serious, often fatal, if not almost all fatal, I just say neurological diseases that have really not just no treatment, but also no sort of direction for a treatment. So really, really tough illnesses to think about how to treat. In aggregate, you're talking about many millions of patients who are very, very severely affected. So once an Alzheimer's disease drug comes out, it'll get to patients pretty quickly. And if it takes a few years, it takes a few years. The bigger question is the first real Alzheimer's drug in forever, I mean, since the disease has been discovered, really, will be a huge impact. But who's going to come up with it and when? That's the harder part. So I think the question is, how do we accelerate more basic research, more intelligent basic research? How do we actually finance that research and incentivize that research? Because right now it's sort of, we can see that, and things like NIH are great, and they come up with a lot of great things, but could there be a better way than just NIH? And we've seen pharma, in essence, abandon basic research, in my opinion, and I think that's a really dangerous thing to do. I think that to really understand Alzheimer's, drug companies have to sort of solve that problem themselves, relying on NIH to dole out cash to universities, and the universities will go publish the stuff, and eventually it'll filter its way to the pharma companies. I'm not sure that's a great business model. I think the Pfizers and Mercks of the world need to actually, dig in and do their own research on Alzheimer's, in my opinion. Should we legalize abortion? That's not something I really can touch with a 10-foot pole, not because I'm timid, but it's just not something that I know a lot about, and it's not something, I can really touch. I just, I know my little corners of the world, and, talking about things that are nothing to do with me or something I don't understand, just a disservice, in my opinion. Should judges have a limit of service? That's something I can talk about, but I probably shouldn't. A different quadrant on that 2x2 square. I have a lot to say about that. I think judges should, I don't even know what to say. Should some jobs have age limits is another good one. There's a famous judge that is around 100 years old that's still sitting on the bench and sentencing people. I think that's a little scary, if you ask me. Can AI and robots actually replace healthcare providers? I do. I think in many, many ways they will, or they have. Surgeons won't be replaced by robots anytime soon, unless you've used the Da Vinci machine by Intuitive Surgical. But in general, I think most doctor-patient interactions can be replaced by AI. What's your opinion on Accutane? I took it 15 years ago and haven't been the same since, so I'm sorry to hear that. I assume you haven't been the same since in a bad way. Accutane is a really bizarre drug. If anybody wants to look into the history of retinoids, which are vitamin A analogs, they're certainly good for your skin, but they come with a ton of other things. So they're nuclear receptor agonists. So nuclear receptors are really weird kind of parts of biology that are not well understood. And in essence, they control hundreds of different genes at once. So you're really playing with something very close to the master switch, the circuit breaker, the circuit board of biology. And when you play with the nuclear receptors, a lot of things can go right or wrong. And so in any event, FXR is one of the other nuclear receptors, but the retinoid receptor is really interesting, and how it works is not really well understood. So Accutane has neuropsychiatric effects, liver effects, and of course skin effects. The skin effects go great. You'll never have acne again as long as you take Accutane, but all that other stuff is really dangerous. So now Accutane, I believe, has been pulled from the market in many places. There are still retinoid creams, which are a much better way to give the medicine, I would think. But the systemic circulation approach is second to none in terms of efficacy. Some people can take it and have no problem, but for other people, there are many people who will have commit suicide or attempt suicide or have liver failure, all kinds of other things, really terrible depression. I've heard it all. The Accutane history of side effects is really, really, really wild. Ray Kurzweil's predictions. I haven't kept up with Ray's stuff. I don't even know what he does anymore. But he was one of my heroes growing up. Are better opiates possible? I don't think opiates themselves, using the sort of opioid receptors that we have and the morpholino structure, are possible. But I do think better pain drugs are possible. And I would point you to Vertex's sodium channel antagonists as potential cures for pain. I know that sounds a little wild, but it is a little wild. What Vertex is doing with pain is, I think, could be one of the biggest inventions ever. Nobody wants to talk about pain because it's one of these really, really hard to talk about fields, and we tend to have forsaken it and like kind of, labeled it as a dirty word, and something pharma especially wants to run away from as fast as it can. Pharma is a bunch of chickens, basically. I mean, I think there's, after I raised the price of that drug, a lot of people started talking about, well, we can't raise prices of anything anymore, and we have to be really, really sensitive about it. And maybe that's the right approach, maybe it isn't, but pain is something that people have, hundreds of millions of people have, and people really do need, patients really do need a solution. And in fact, doctors have become a bit chicken about prescribing opioids now to patients who really need them. Thankfully, Vertex's drug could really be the solution. It's one of the most beautifully made medicines and the greatest biology ever done. They found a tribe of patients who cannot feel pain. These are people that have a congenital mutation that renders them insensitive to any form of pain. It's very bizarre. Medicine studied these people for some time, and they've determined that they have a mutation in a protein called NAV 1.7 or 1.8. This is a sodium ion channel. We have a bunch of them, but if you have a mutation in that specific one, you have a so-called channelopathy that renders you impervious to pain. And so anyway, you can induce that mutation in people. You could do it genetically, or you could do it pharmacologically. Probably better to do it pharmacologically. And so I think you can, potentially cure pain in a lot of ways. Now, will that drug then have its own dependency and side effect issues? Very well might. Vertex has actually done an amazing thing where they are now on their third or fourth version of this drug. And I personally felt that the first 3 versions they made looked great, and there was nothing they should have done. They shouldn't have changed anything. But the Vertex people really want the perfect drug that has no chance for side effects and no chance for liability and abuse, which I commend them for doing. It's not what I would have done, to be frank. There are plenty of people that desperately need a pain drug that's not perfect. Whether or not you can get the perfect drug in the first place is still an open question. But I commend the company for sort of being patient. There are a lot of people who are resistant to opioids, or the dose of opioids they're on isn't enough, and things like that. So I think the company is being a little, not selfish, but short-sighted about those patients. But anyway, it's going to be really interesting to see if Vertex can thread this needle. And, a lot of people in pharma are not excited about the Vertex drug because of that opioid kind of overhang that sort of exists. But I think we have to shed ourselves from that and realize that people have chronic regional pain syndrome, people have treatment-resistant pain that requires intrathecal, which is spinal cord injection of different drugs. There are a lot of people with neuropathic pain, which is basically untreatable by opioids or anything else for that matter. So ultimately I think, I'm really happy about the development there by Vertex, and potentially not another opioid, but just a totally different new signal. So schizophrenia is another great question. I'm so glad you asked that question, my YouTube friend. There are not a lot of great research being done in schizophrenia. The new muscarinic agents are kind of the first big new drugs. So I think between a muscarinic and a atypical antipsychotic, you might actually get reasonably good control of psychosis. This is a big breakthrough. It's coming from this company called Karuna. Karuna decided to take an old Eli Lilly drug and do something really neat where the muscarinic receptors, depending on how you interact with them, you can cause a bunch of other side effects. And so they combined 2 different drugs to turn up one and turn down one other signal, which is a really neat, smart way to do it. So really, really intelligent, and I think you're going to see a bunch of muscarinics come out and improve the lives of people with schizophrenia and probably bipolar disease and things like that. So the problem with the atypical antipsychotics is they work really, really well, but they cause these terrible side effects. And most people I know who have taken atypicals or should be on atypicals really don't want to be on them. And they cause some tremendous weight gain, movement disorders, drooling, all types of stuff like that. So a low dose atypical like Abilify and potentially the new Karuna drug combined, you could get some really potent, hopefully efficacy and help people who have these terrible illnesses get back to normal. I think somebody just mentioned they're starting the Vertex clinical trial. Good for you. Don't tell us too much about that. Material non-public information. ECT is actually a really good question. Charles Gaviria is asking about how is ECT ever approved? Well, it's funny, ECT works really, really well. It sounds crazy, but it's not one flew over the cuckoo's nest. It's a lot tamer than that. They anesthetize you, interestingly, before they do the ECT, so you don't feel any of it. It's not that different from one flew over the cuckoo's nest, but it isn't, you're not conscious for it. And it really does work. It's really remarkable. The new drug, which is an old drug called ketamine, seems to sort of have ECT-like effects. ECT is sort of the last line therapy for TRD, treatment-resistant depression, people who are suicidal, people who are really, really sick. And those patients are at their wits' end. SSRIs, SNRIs don't work. Wellbutrin doesn't work. MAOIs don't work. You're really running into a lot of dead ends with patients like this. And ketamine is the new solution, I think, but ECT still, for a long time, has been and will continue to be one option. And it's really something people sort of sleep on or dismiss, but it works really, really well, surprisingly. No one's quite sure how or why, but it does sort of show you that there is some mystery still in the human body. And my friend Jesse Michaels, who has a podcast that sort of deals with not quite the paranormal, that's probably an insult to him, but it's probably what most scientists would say, but deals with kind of like the exceptional and impossible, things like UFOs and things like, and again, Jesse's a really smart, guy. I put up his intelligence as up there with anybody's, but he at least wants to sort of delve into these things a little bit. And he talks about bioelectronics, which is something a lot of people don't talk about, that our bodies do run on electricity, and the ECT somehow interferes with that, and we don't know how. We're sort of afraid to ask, quite frankly, as scientists, because we'd rather things fit into that neat world of pharmaceuticals, which are really easy to understand. You can make cartoons about them. They're really simple. Whereas like some of these sort of more like not obvious sort of therapeutics are very hard to understand. Like there's one involving a magnet, which I've always thought was bullshit, from a drug company called Novocure. It's not a drug. It's literally a magnet. And I'm sitting here thinking this has to be a great short. I like to short sell stocks, or I bet their stocks go down. This company is talking about this magnet is going to help you live longer from cancer. No way, right? And it does seem to work, which I hate to even have those words come out of my mouth because it's so bizarre. But there are things about medicine that we don't know, and it won't be so bizarre years from now. I'll give you a good example of Revlimid, which at one point was called Thalamid. Thalamid is what actually created the FDA. Thalamid caused birth defects, some of the most horrific birth defects known to man, and the FDA decided to get really serious about requiring safety for drugs. But Thalamid also seemed to be a wonder drug for multiple myeloma. And if you look at the structure of Thalamid, a lot of people said, well, how does it work? It's just a pill. We should be able to figure this out. And nobody could quite put their finger on it. And they finally figured out that it's working as a so-called PROTAC. And the way it works is not something anybody could have guessed. It is a brand new way for medicine to work. And now all these companies are doing PROTACs, PROTAC, to do other things in the body, like potentially treat breast cancer or prostate cancer, amongst other things. So PROTACs are a brand new way to make medicine. Many startups are head over heels about them. A few friends of mine work at some of the PROTAC companies. A friend of mine who just passed away worked at one. And these companies are going to change the way medicine is made and the way it works. But at the same time, nobody knew that thalidomide was an accidental Protac. Nobody made it trying to become a Protac. They made it just sort of randomly, and it turns out it's a Protac. So it's a really funny kind of thing how some of this stuff works, and we don't know everything. I think that's the hardest thing to accept. Now, 99% of medicine works the way you expect it to and why you expect it to, and it's not a bad thing to say, well, if I don't know how it works, I'm not going to invest in it, or I'm not going to whatever study it. But occasionally you do have those edge cases where like you don't know how it works, but it is working and you can't deny it. So those are really things that throw us for a loop, and it's really hard to figure out. And ECT is one of those things where God only knows how ECT works, and we might unravel that, decades from now, or maybe somebody's already unraveled it. But it's one of these things where it's such a mystery, and it's such a Thalamid was the brand name, and thalidomide is the generic name. So it is thalidomide. But anyway, any questions? Anyone wants to come up and chit chat? You're welcome to.